So welcome, good afternoon. Welcome back. My name is Dr. Josh Krasna. I'm from the Jerusalem Institute of Strategic Studies. We're going to do this a little differently. I'm going to introduce in brief all members of our panel now. And if you have questions about them, you can ask them afterwards. So, Micky Aharonson, who is going to speak about the Russian perspectives on the Eastern Mediterranean, was head of the Foreign Relations Director and National Security Council in the Prime Minister's Office between 2006 and 2014. She's an expert on Russia, on foreign aid to the Palestinian Authority, and on military political decision-making. Oh, you guys switched place, so that's a... Alexander Pesner is founding director of the Chinese Media Center at the College of Management and Academic Studies in Rishon LeZion as an expert in political communication in contemporary China. Mike Eisenstadt is the Kahn Fellow and director of the Washington Institute's Military and Security Studies program. He's a specialist on Persian Gulf and Arab-Israeli security affairs. Prior to joining Institute, he worked for the U.S. government and served for 26 years as an officer in the U.S. Army Reserves, including multiple times in Iraq and another place in the region. Nick Laragakis is president and chief operating officer of the American Hellenic Institute, a nonprofit Greek-American public policy center. He has held different positions with the AHI since joining the organization in 1987. He is regularly interviewed by Greek and Greek-American media on issues affecting U.S.-Greek relations, and he is very active in organizing congressional fact-finding missions, legislative conferences, and other conferences on Greek-American relations. So this distinguished panel will be discussing the extra-regional actors in the Eastern Mediterranean area. Okay, so you have to speak from the podium. I don't. So we're going to have a Russian perspective, a Chinese perspective, an American's perspective, and the perspective on the role of the Greek diaspora. So I'd like to start with Micky.
Okay. So I have the traditional role of complaining for having you here after lunch. I'll do my best to keep you awake by discussing the Russian perspective of what is going on in the East Mediterranean. What do we talk about when we talk about Russian involvement and goal in the East Mediterranean? And more importantly, what do Russians think that the West is going to do about it? So, some facts. I would like to concentrate on the military Russian presence in the East Mediterranean. Beyond existing Russian forces in the area, mainly in Syria, in August this year, Russia declared a closure of aerial and naval space in the East Mediterranean for a military exercise which took place for about a week. In August, Russia has deployed several frigates to the Mediterranean via the Bosphorus, part of what Russian media called Moscow's largest naval buildup since it entered the Syrian conflict in 2015. The size of the naval force, more than a dozen vessels, including destroyers, frigates, and submarines, some armed with Caliber cruise missiles. It is estimated that Russia needs more time to establish supporting infrastructure to sustain a permanent presence of such a huge flotilla, and a huge flotilla it is, and the expansion of the Tartus port, is going on accordingly. The relevant question for the growing Russian presence in the East Mediterranean is why? What is the purpose? What is the target? Who is the enemy? Is it the Islamic State or is it the rebels? I would like to suggest that the goal is not Syria. If I exaggerate a little bit, Russia had Syria at hello, or at least at the first shot by Russian airplanes against Syrian rebels in 2015. I would like to suggest that Russian growing presence in the East Mediterranean is part of a general global goal of making Russia great again, Putin's slogan in the latest elections. President Putin is working hard to bring back Russian empire, not regionally but globally. And the Russian growing presence in the East Mediterranean is no exception. An internal explanation is that intervening either in Ukraine or Russia or in Ukraine or Syria or elsewhere shifts public focus to external threats from Russia and away from internal challenges to President Putin. This is mainly following the pension reform, when Putin's popularity has dropped to its lowest point since the annexation of Crimea in 2014. In a poll conducted last October, 58% of Russians supported Putin, down from 75% last year. It's a big drop. Now, due to Russia's view of the world arena as a zero-sum game, Russian growing military and other presence in the East Mediterranean means working along this equation. Wherever the West is getting stronger, Russia is getting weaker. In Lebanon, the Russians have been attempting for years to offer military packages that were largely declined until this November due to American pressure. In Syria, Russia is the peacemaker and the mediator, and the major diplomatic processes are hosted by Russia, while the US is practically irrelevant. The zero-sum game concept is real. Once Egypt was deprived of military aid by the US due to what was described as human rights issue after the Muslim Brothers lost power, Russia poured in with a $3.5 billion defense contract. As part of the zero-sum game concept, Russia has accused the United States of building up its own forces in the Middle East in preparation of a possible strike on Syrian government forces. This was just before the supposed plan of Russia's ally, President Bashar al-Assad, of an assault on the last significant rebel territory, Idlib in the north. As an answer, the Admiral Grigorovich and Admiral Essen frigates sailed through the Istanbul's Bosphorus towards the Mediterranean. These frigates demonstrated to the West that it should aspire for a political solution in the region and not military involvement, or otherwise it would risk an escalation. In the struggle for dominance and influence, the world is regarded by Russia as a single ecosystem that should be treated accordingly. Russia is stepping up the game and raising the bets, globally, not only regionally. The Russian September military exercise in the East Mediterranean cannot be regarded separately from the November incident with Ukraine in the Kerch Strait, which was a major escalation because it was the first time Russians shot Ukrainians, not in disguise, but under Russian flag. What happened after the recent Russian move in Kerch Strait? Nothing. NATO continues to state it fully supports Ukraine's sovereignty and its territorial integrity, but hardly any steps were taken after the West, and the Ukrainian sailors remain in Russian captivity despite international calls for their release. The world did not effectively respond. It was noted by the Kremlin, just as it was noticed by the Kremlin that President Obama did not realize his threat following the use of chemical weapons in Syria. As the Russian media mocked the West after the various threats, if you want to shoot, shoot, don't talk. Now, in this one ecosystem perception, Russia perceives the East Mediterranean as the doorstep to its backyard. And if the West chooses to act provocatively, in Russian eyes, of course, in one place, it will send a clear message to the West in another. Provocations are, for example, the discussions that have been taking place since September that are dealing with setting up an American military base in Poland on the border with Kaliningrad, the Russian enclave in the Baltic Sea, nicknamed Fort Trump. Another increase in NATO's or Western presence on Russia's border is perceived as a direct threat and provocation in the eyes of the Russian leadership. Russian official recently noted that those who don't want to listen to Sergei Lavrov, Russian foreign minister, who explains everything in detail, will have to listen to what Sergei Shoigu will explain, the Russian defense minister. Unlike Western military involvement abroad that is always aimed at a certain end, the Kremlin does not say or indicate there is an end to Russian military involvement abroad. In a Russian ambassadors gathering this year, President Putin said, "Goal number one is to increase Russian footprint globally. Military means are clearly an effective means." Europe's stance, or the lack of it, regarding Russia's growing military presence in the East Mediterranean near European borders is also noted in Moscow, in addition to the difference in approach between the well-off Western European states and the less well-off East Mediterranean European states when it comes to dealing with Russia. While Western European states pay a lip service, condemn Russia, and sometimes act, very rarely though, Russia, East Mediterranean states, stricken by economic difficulties and ongoing burden of refugees, inevitably act upon their national interest and regional constraints and realities. Let's take Cyprus, for example. Moscow is allowed to use the Andreas Papandreou Air Base and the Evangelos Florakis Naval Base near Limassol on the island's southern coast. Formally, it can only be used in cases of emergency and for humanitarian missions. That is, for these bases to serve an evacuation center for Russian citizens in case of a turmoil in the Middle East. Cyprus is also a host to significant amounts of Russian funds that are channeled to the banks in Cyprus, and Cypriot economy is heavily dependent on Russian cash inflows. As means of becoming a superpower once again, another typical Russian tendency in the region is aspiring to serve as a mediator in international regional conflicts. In Cyprus, for example, Russia offered a number of times to act as a mediator between the Turkish and Greek institutions of Cyprus. Another case, Greece. In 2014, the Greeks have protested against the European blame of Russia for the intensification of fighting in eastern Ukraine. And in April 2015, Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras called for an end to European sanctions on Russia. In June 2015, Tsipras declared that Europe had been living in the illusion of being the hub of the universe in the literal sense, while newly, and I'm quoting, while newly emerging forces are coming to play a more vital role at the economic and geopolitical level, like the BRICS countries and the Eurasian Union led by Russia. So in general, Russia noticed very well that the West not only fails to project strength, but it also fails to demonstrate unity. I'll conclude by saying that, as it goes without saying about Syria and growingly Lebanon, Syria, Greece, and Egypt relate to Russia as a counterweight to the West. Russian capacities cannot compare, of course, to those of the West in terms of financial aid packages, for example, but they can serve as a bargaining chip with the US and the European Union. Russian military and diplomatic presence in the East Mediterranean marks a relationship between Russia and the West that is characterized with growing rivalry and the need to consider Russian interests and demands way beyond the former Soviet territories. In March 2014, in the midst of the Ukrainian crisis, President Barack Obama claimed that Russia was merely, emphasis on merely, a regional power. Beyond the evident insult to Russian inspiration and leadership, I would like to ask this distinguished audience to rethink this approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Micky. Mike Eisenstadt on the United States.